So let's transition to radiological agents. And this is something that's very much attached to risk perception, just as biological threats are attached to risk perception. And we'll begin with some basic principles to understand the types of radiation threats that we're concerned about in public health. So the term here is ionizing radiation, and in very sort of lay terminology, this is radiation that has enough energy to kick out an electron from an atom. And there are different types of ionizing radiation, as depicted on this slide using Greek letters. And the first type at the top, it's called alpha radiation. And this is radiation, as depicted here in the diagram, that has very little penetrating power. It can barely even penetrate the outer layers of the skin, or in this case, doesn't really readily even pass through a piece of paper. The next type of ionizing radiation is beta. When we think of beta form, it's more penetrating than alpha, as you can see here. It can penetrate through paper, but stops at an aluminum barrier. Last but not least, we have what are called gamma rays, and that's at the bottom of this diagram. And gamma rays are the most penetrating types of ionizing radiation. Now, this slide can be a bit of a fooler, as they say, because one may say, well, alpha forms of ionizing radiation, they look pretty innocuous, right? They can't even penetrate paper or even farther than the outermost layers of the skin. Well, that's why this is a bit of a fooler. The reason for that is that if ingested, absorbed, or inhaled, which are the three routes by which ionizing radiation can enter the body, there's obviously very little distance between cells. So even if alpha radiation can't externally outside the body penetrate paper or the outer layers of the skin, if it enters the body through ingestion, absorption, or inhalation, it can do tremendous damage at the cellular level, as can beta forms of ionizing radiation, and of course, gamma is also a threat. One of the key aspects of understanding and contextualizing ionizing radiation that frankly is not well known among the general public is that we are always exposed every day and virtually all the time to ionizing radiation. This is a table that describes the sources of ionizing radiation and their respective doses in the US annually. And as you can see, there are several types of sources of ionizing radiation. Interestingly, the chief source of ionizing radiation is radon. So when one gets their basement tested for radon, that's because it's important to assess for radon as a form of ionizing radiation. Radon is a leading form of non-smoking related lung cancer. So we really need to be vigilant about other sources of radiation, ionizing radiation specifically in the environment. And these also can include, as depicted on this slide, radiation within the body, terrestrial, so on the planet, and cosmic radiation. And there are other sources here too. But on the flip side, the good news, if you will, regarding this table as a risk communication tool is it's important to convey to people that ionizing radiation is not a sum of the time phenomenon. Rather, it's an all of the time phenomenon. That makes it seem less exotic, going back to Amir's excellent comments earlier, that things that seem exotic or unusual, and going back to the table by Paul Slovic, this table is something we can use to our benefit from a risk communication standpoint to make radiation seem less exotic to our audiences, because it's not as exotic as people tend to think it is. Let's talk now about health effects of ionizing radiation. So I want to begin this slide with a couple of just background principles here. The first principle is that there are two categories of health effects of ionizing radiation. And in general, if one were to ask someone, what is your chief concern about being exposed to ionizing radiation? The answer is probably cancer. And cancer follows, as I'll describe here on this slide, a specific type of health pattern with regard to its presentation. So let's go back to the beginning of the slide and put all of what I just said into context. So acute health effects of ionizing radiation are known as deterministic health effects. And by that we mean, if you quote me a given dose that one has received, I will be able to tell you that certain organ systems will or will not have been affected. So as you can see, hematopoietic, meaning bone marrow, involves exposure at the hundreds of rem level. And we won't go into dosing terminology just in the interest of time. But as the amount of dose goes up, these acute effects involve different organ systems. In this case, in the thousands of rem exposure level, we're talking about effects on the gastrointestinal system. And then at the tens of thousands of rem, we're talking about central nervous system involvement. Interestingly and importantly, from a public health and healthcare standpoint, at 600 rem exposure, there's near 100% fatality. So this is important from a risk communication standpoint because based on the deterministic model, severity is a function of dose. The higher the dose for these kinds of health effects under acute on this slide increases with the amount of dose. So you can see increasing involvement of different organ systems with higher dose. So on the bottom of this slide, you'll see delayed health effects. And delayed health effects of ionizing radiation include two types of health effects. One we've already talked about, which is deterministic, where severity increases with dose. But the other type of health effect, in terms of delayed health effects, in this case cancer, follows an entirely different model. It's called random or stochastic. What that means is that there is no such thing as zero risk of cancer from ionizing radiation exposure. So with acute deterministic health effects and deterministic health effects in general, severity is a function of dose. With random, or in more formal terms, stochastic health effects like cancer, risk is a function of dose. So why is this relevant from a risk communication standpoint in public health for radiological events? As I mentioned earlier, there is no such thing as zero risk of developing cancer from ionizing radiation. However, the risk, if the ionizing radiation level is low, is also low. Importantly, the delayed aspects of ionizing radiation health effects require long-term monitoring, including cancer surveillance programs and cancer registries by public health systems, because most radiogenic cancers develop 20 or more years following exposure to ionizing radiation. So from a practice-based standpoint, it's critical to introduce and maintain surveillance systems for cancer. So the last reason why this is a challenge from a risk communication standpoint is if someone says, well, I received a given dose of ionizing radiation from this event, will I get cancer? One cannot say yes or no. One can say that the risk of developing cancer is low. But in disasters and public health emergencies, people want black and white answers. But as public health risk communicators, it's imperative that we communicate accurately rather than simplistically and oversimplistically and even misleadingly in that regard. So let's talk about medical issues pertaining to ionizing radiation health effects. So as building upon content from the previous slide, acute health effects include, if, for example, if there was something called a dirty bomb, which is more formally known as a radiological dispersal device, there would be the usual effects from bomb-type attack, shrapnel injuries, and the like. There is something called acute radiation syndrome, which involves, as alluded to in the previous slide, different organ systems acutely. And internal contamination, which, as alluded to previously, can be caused by either inhalation, ingestion, or absorption of ionizing radiation. As mentioned previously also, but emphasized here, delayed health effects are radiation carcinogenesis, so development of cancer, which can occur and typically does occur, if it occurs, 20 or more years following exposure for most forms of ionizing radiation. It's also important for people who are pregnant that we consider both the acute and delayed effects of in utero exposure to ionizing radiation. Let's just briefly discuss contamination with ionizing radiation. So there are two different categories, broadly speaking. There's external contamination, where in one who's exposed to ionizing radiation from, let's say, a dirty bomb event, would carry radioactive atoms on their clothing or skin. One can also theoretically be irradiated by penetrating radiation. As we described earlier, gamma rays are the most penetrating. You'll also recall that when you go to a doctor's office and get an X-ray, they put a lead shield on you because X-rays are also highly penetrating, and lead is a very good protective mechanism against that. One can carry contamination away from the site of an event, such as a dirty bomb, on surfaces, so skin, clothing, as alluded to a moment ago. Next, let's talk about internal contamination, in which radioactive atoms enter the body by ingestion, so eating or drinking, breathing gases or aerosols, or absorption through skin or wounds. So another way to phrase that is ingestion, inhalation, or absorption, respectively. Or there can be a combination of one or more of those routes. It's also possible for one to carry contamination away from the site within their body or on their clothing or skin. So an important aspect of response to a radiological emergency is decontamination, where people should go to their homes, or if they're at home, remove their clothing, leave it in a bag outside their homes, wash face, head, and hands, and shower copiously immediately, and put on fresh clothing. So that's a really critical aspect of what we can consider self-decontamination in effect following such an event. So as we presented today, biological and radiological threats are critical environmental issues for public health agencies and other stakeholders to consider in the context of public health emergency and disaster preparedness and response. Today, we've presented key concepts, including risk, and important principles from a public health and clinical standpoint for both biological agents and radiological agents. Thank you very much.